Hello, everyone. How are you? Happy Tuesday. Oh, I hesitated because I wasn't quite sure what today was. Um, but I am so excited about this particular investigation, as I've called it, because so much has been written about the Detroit mob attacks of 1863. But I am happy to say that there's more evidence that I have uncovered that is going to really, really put this particular mob attack in perspective. Now, as you guys are aware, there have been many mob attacks throughout the 18th and the 19th century that targeted Black neighborhoods, communities, and towns, and I'm going to be doing deep dives into that. I would love to do Tulsa, Oklahoma, but so much has been written about it that I don't know if there's any new evidence to find. So I'm going to be focusing on the, the mob attacks on towns that weren't talked about as much, but Detroit was definitely talked about, and you will find loads of information about the Detroit mob attacks of 1863 online. But I want to give you guys new again information so that we can move into having updated conversations about this particular incident. Now, okay, we're in Detroit, Michigan, 1863, right? And like most towns in, I guess you could say, the North, it was a bustling town, lots of people, lots of horses and buggies and commerce. And to put things into perspective, in 1860, Detroit's population was around 45,000. So in 1863, it's probably grown exponentially as well. Now, of course, Detroit is known as being a chocolate city, but back in those days, it was a white majority. But there were formerly enslaved blacks from the South that were thriving in this city. And to put it in perspective, there weren't that many blacks that were in the city. There were approximately 2,000. I call them Aboriginals in the city. I will you'll probably see me go back and forth in using that term. And of course, the black population were also skilled laborers. So you're talking about many people coming from the south, going up north, and bringing their skills and their expertise to the table, which is why they were thriving so well in a new city. Now, to put it in perspective, what was Detroit like? Well, as you know, with any kind of renewed growth, it also means you have more boarding houses, which are going to house men primarily who are coming to work. You're going to have more saloons and bars. And in the case of Detroit, you had about 500 to 600 saloons during the 1815, 1860s. So there's a lot of drinking going on. You also had brothels. Detroit was known for their brothels. You also had, brothels that were usually in the downtown Detroit area. There was some intrigue around brothels getting a lot of press during that time. But then they kind of moved and shifted to downtown Detroit. And mostly they were called men's clubs, okay, as is evidenced in this illustration here. You also had more vagrants, you had draft dodgers, of course, there was a war going on. You had transients, which means you had seasonal workers. And with all of this, you had a great deal of crime. Yeah, 50,000 people in a bustling city. Yeah, you're going to have some crime. Um, Now, you also had a great deal of troops that were in Detroit, right? Because the Civil War was in full swing. So you've got this vibrant city plus your military, right? Now, to put things into perspective of what was happening in 1863, now, I won't go, bit by bit by bit into that. But for instance, everything changed when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And he signed it really as a war measure to save the Union. People will say he saved, Lincoln saved, freed the slaves. He did, but he didn't. He freed the slaves that were in states that are in rebellion against the Union. Now, keep that in mind. He freed the slaves that were in those states that were actually fighting against the Union. So there were a whole lot of other slaves that were not free in other territories. So just really let that sink in. And as stated and said in parts of the Emancipation Proclamation, I will not read the whole thing here. Slaves, quote, slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free. Such persons of suitable conditions will be received into the armed service of the United States. So basically, Lincoln said, you know what? I can't constitutionally really change the status of slaves, but I can create an executive order that changes the dynamic of this war. And so basically, he signed and wrote the Emancipation Proclamation to destabilize the South because he knew what freeing the slaves meant. But he also knew that he needed more men to fight in this war to save the Union. So, yeah. So, to me, that, and as we know, freeing the slaves changed everything, right? So, with all of that, you had some very uncomfortable and angry white people. And it made the whites particularly uncomfortable because they knew that this meant that more blacks were going to come to the North, especially after the war. So there was just this incredible tension throughout the country, not just in Detroit, that the free blacks were going to just change the dynamic of everything. And if you were free, you could also be drafted in the war. So there was a draft that had been instituted, and that had also made many Detroit people very uncomfortable, very angry. They didn't want to fight, and what they thought was a war against, I guess you could say, a war for Black people, and they weren't interested in fighting for the cause. And particularly since so many Michigan soldiers had died in the Union Army already, nobody wanted to die, and they certainly didn't want to die for a Black man. The definite argument in the Civil War shifted from, oh, we're here to save the Union, to now it became, we're here to free the slaves. So that's a whole nother topic and discussion, but I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for what was happening at the time. So, and here we go, the case of William Faulkner, not to be confused with the writer of the same name. Definitely want to make that distinction. So, now the thing about William Faulkner is sometimes in history you will see his name referred to as Thomas Faulkner, and I will explain probably how that happened in a minute, but the newspapers called him William Faulkner, so I'm going to go with that narrative right now. And this was a man who was 42 years old, single. He said that he was of Spanish Indian origin and who passed as white. I'm going to keep it, let that sit right there, right? 42 years old, single, Spanish Indian who was passing as white. Keep in mind, this is 1863. So, and Faulkner also said that he was from Virginia and connected to the Faulkners of that state. So, he might have been related to William Faulkner. We'll never know, right? But as you can see from this newspaper article, there was an incredible, horrendous crime that had been committed, and he was at the heart of it. But I want to just paint the picture of who he was a little bit before we dive into that. He was also a regular voter who voted on the pro-slavery Democratic ticket, right? Just keeping that in mind. So, all intents and purposes, William Faulkner saw himself as a white man, even though the newspapers called him a Negro. He was a white man and acted as such. Now, the thing about William Faulkner is that he owned a saloon and eating house located on the south side of Michigan Avenue, opposite of the Detroit Central Market, which you see pictured here in the 19th century. So, like I mentioned before, there were a lot of saloons. He was just one of many who owned an establishment. Now, Faulkner was not a nice dude. He had a bad reputation prior to the said incident, and he was known to lure young girls to his establishment. Right? I'm just keeping it out there. And keep in mind, again, this man is single with no children, at least on record, which is really odd for men of that day. Like we kind of look, we don't look as sideways at men who are 42 and single, but definitely back then you did. So, additionally, with Faulkner, he was known to make some interesting remarks about being a quote unquote black person. There was a veteran who was interviewed during this whole case, and he had said, "Yes, I spoke to Faulkner, and he told me if he thought he had one drop of colored blood in his veins, if he could, he would let it out." Okay, that's how he felt about being black. And he was also known for often saying he would never serve colored men a drop in his establishment. So again, you have a man who sees himself as white. He thinks he's white. He don't like black folks. None of that. So it's so interesting how this man who was passing as white clearly didn't want to have anything to do with being black. And even in the newspaper said that he looked like he was white if you looked at him at first glance. Now, the incident. the incident, Monday, February 16th, 1863. Now, Mary Brown, a 9-year old white girl, was sent by her aunt to the post office to mail a letter. So on the way there, she walks into Faulkner's saloon along with another girl who's black, Ellen Hoover, and they say to warm their feet and to get food. And this is where Mary was allegedly raped. So of course, it was this fact here that made me do a deep dive on what this all meant. And we're going to get to the story, the wholeness of the story as we go in a minute. But of course, I paused. It was always like, what 9-year-old girl is comfortable walking into a saloon in downtown Detroit, even if she's just kind of, not going to school and just not very educated. She apparently had been to the saloon before, and according to Faulkner, he had kicked her out both times, but I guess she kept coming back. So naturally, what happens is that once this allegation is made, Faulkner is immediately arrested and charged. Immediately arrested. There's a lot of protests, just violence in the city, and it just was escalating, right? And getting him to and from the courthouse was an incredible challenge. And I won't go bit by bit on that because there's so much written about it, and you can read about this on your own. I just want to kind of get through the gist of the facts. But after the trial, the jury immediately returned a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced Faulkner to life in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. So during the trial, there was a lot of, like I said, violence. They were trying, the white mob was trying to kill Faulkner, and so they had to bring in reinforcements in the military, and it was pretty heady. So, but the trial happens, there's a guilty verdict. Um, but what's interesting is that that wasn't enough for him to be sentenced to life in prison. What happens is that the local papers said Faulkner's case resulted in the bloodiest day that ever dawned upon Detroit. This is literally Detroit's first major mob, race mob attack. So on March 6th, what happened? 35 buildings were burned to the ground and a number of other buildings damaged by fire. At least 2 people died and a multitude of others, mostly African American, were beaten. So what happens is that as Faulkner is being taken from the courthouse to prison, they're trying to kill him. And it is just mayhem, blood, and just incredible drama. And I won't repeat all the slurs that they were hurling at him, but they were out for blood, and not just for Faulkner, but for anybody that was black. They were getting it too, and they got it in the most horrific way. So ultimately, this went on for a few hours. Almost 200 blacks lost their homes and businesses. Many fled into the woods for safety, and some even went to Canada, never to return. The military had to be called in to suppress the riot because it was just so out of control. And ultimately, in the end, there was an estimated $15,000 to $20,000 in property damages. That would be about 700,000 in today's dollars. So, as you can imagine, before the military was even called in, there was just incredible trauma. And there were and are some accounts of what happened that particular day that were written in the words of an anonymous person who wrote the account of what happened on that horrible, horrible day. And again, you could find that online, I'm sure. It's just pretty heady. People were beaten, women and children, people's money was taken. It was just anything that could happen happened that day. Now, what's really interesting, really, really interesting, Faulkner was taken to the prison, and he was asked by the guard who was taking him in, he says, "How do you feel about your new house?" Right? I guess the guard was trying to be funny, but Faulkner says, and I quote, "I feel perfectly happy. Now I shall have a house and steady employment, and I had rather be here than keeping a saloon in Detroit." That's a very, very loaded response. What did he mean by, "I feel perfectly happy, now I shall have a house and steady employment"? Huh. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but I'll let that sit for a minute, because what did Faulkner know that we don't know? Well, I'm going to tell you in a minute. It's some deep stuff here. So there were a lot of discrepancies and oddities in the case. And, you know, like with all things, you see this bustling central area of downtown Detroit. It's near the Detroit River. There's businesses, there's commerce, there's lots of activity, even illegal activity. There's a lot going on. And so you have to naturally say, well, who's really running the city? Who's really running this, making this all work, right? So when I look at a Detroit map of 1863, and I found this map. It really specifically outlined how Detroit was laid out. And as you can see down here, here's the Detroit River, right? And at the time, William C. Duncan was the mayor of Detroit. Acting mayor was Francis B. Phelps. Now, at the time, the day of the riot, William Duncan wasn't even in Detroit. He was in Lansing doing business, which I find interesting too. The day of the most horrendous riot in his city, he's not even there. Who knew he wasn't going to be there? Who knew that? You know what I mean? Like, and like, again, this isn't conspiracy. This is all just facts I'm putting out here. And at the time of the riots, Francis Phelps was completely overwhelmed. He was overwhelmed with what to do with this. So, but going back to the map again, I squared this section out here because this is where all the black people lived. This was the quote unquote colored section, right? And this area here is central. Well, I guess you could say this where the central market was. Now, as you can see, this is prime real estate on this river here. Okay. Now, I also going to show you a map and show you the location of things to give you even more scope. So right here is the post office that Mary was supposed to go to that day, right? Before everything went completely awry. This circle here is where Central Market is located, which is where Faulkner's saloon was, right? And Ellen Hoover is the black girl who was also allegedly assaulted by Faulkner. She had she didn't tell her story right away. She said she feared for her life, didn't tell her story. Then she gets on stand and says, "Look, yeah, this happened to me. I'm telling you the truth now." So her story was full of discrepancies in the beginning, but then she said she had lied because she feared for her life. But in any case, as you can see, Ellen lives right here in the black section on Congress Street. Here is where Mary lives. Mary lives up here, and she lived in 94 Croghan Street, and this is based on a directory. Her aunt's name was Rose Brown, and so I found her and confirmed some other things and saw that, yes, indeed, they were living on Croghan Street. So as you can see, Ellen and Mary didn't live too far from each other, right? So that is a spatial dynamic of what was going on at the time. And Mary would have done her little shortcuts and walked around and gotten there. And she said along the way she met Ellen, which she said she never knew her before. But that's another story, right? So now on May 22nd, okay, now keep in mind Faulkner's already in prison, um, serving his time. Now 2 months later, Mary Brown and Ellen Hoover are convicted on larceny charges for stealing money out of a cash drawer of a butcher, right? Now, the two became companions during the incident, but many allege that they knew each other before. And I kind of have to say that too, because, they didn't live that far from each other. And these were, even though um, the black people and the white people lived in certain sections, you still all knew each other um, to a certain degree. And then, of course, it was later discovered that Mary Brown was a quote unquote prostitute. Now, I use that term lightly because back in those days, and even now, she really would have been a child sex slave. And again, I go back to who was running the young girls in the city, because as you can see, Mary was very comfortable walking into Faulkner's saloon, and for a man who was known to lure young girls, she probably knew that he would at least welcome her, maybe give her some money, maybe give her some food. So he was known, right? But I just find it interesting that the two girls at the heart of this, they get arrested. Now, what's really interesting is that the man that they stole from, I mean, I'm still confirming this, but there was a man that had a butcher shop on Congress Street, and his last name was Brown, interestingly. So I say to myself, oh, well, was this a relative of Mary's? Was this somebody that she knew? Because it's stealing money out of a cash drawer. You don't just walk in and steal money out of the drawer. You have to actually have access to the drawer. So, again, that might have been a relative of Mary's. So, now what happened to the mob? What happened to all those white men? Okay. Now, they arrested 46, but only 6 of them were convicted of rioting or assault. Now, check this out. Of the 18 arrested, there were 9 who were skilled workers, right? And then many of the victims mentioned the Irish more often than the Dutch, i.e., Germans, in their accounts of the violence. So at least 20 of these men were Irish, right? Now, I'll get to why that is significant. Now, of course, in a city like Detroit, you had a lot of people from different areas, particularly Germany, Ireland. And Mary, in particular, was Irish. I'm just putting that out there. She was Irish, okay? But none of that came out in the newspaper reports that I read. No one said, "Oh, Mary was Irish," or no one mentioned the ethnicities of these people, right? So, what's most interesting about this mob is that there was 21 of the names of the men could not be found in the Detroit directories. And this is a strong indication that they were either transients or they had a low occupation status. So Normally, when you look in the directories, and this is just from a genealogical perspective, your name in the directory was a big deal. It tied you to the community. It showed who you were, your profession, your name, your address. Those things were very important to people back then, and it spoke a lot to, in some cases, your status in the community. So when you see that 21 of the men who were arrested were not even in the Detroit directory, what you have to say to yourself, well, who were these men? And why were these men causing trouble? Well, you can say, yeah, they weren't from there. They didn't have anything to lose. They were, Irish of a certain descent. So they were going to defend their own. Okay, you could say that. But I think there's something much more deeper than that. Because why would you, as a man coming into a city that you don't know anything about, you're going to get involved in something so heinous as a mob attack? Yes, you could say they have nothing to lose, but they also are there to make money. And at the same time, they're getting paid under the table for other things. I'm just going to put that out there. So, fast forward to years later, and guess what? Now, you guys probably already know this and knew I was going to say it. Mary Brown and Ellen Hoover confessed that their story was all a lie and that they made it up. Now, I'm pretty sure you guys aren't incredibly surprised by this because without even knowing all the details of the case, I knew they were lying, looking at it from an objective perspective. But remember, Mary Brown is about 9 or 10, and Ellen is about 12 or 13. So again, why would they make up this elaborate lie? Why? Now, yes, the narrative has often been that whenever a black town was burned down and there was mob violence, it was always centered around a white girl or a white woman being raped. That was often the narrative. That was the playbook. In some cases, that still is the playbook, right? So that was the lie that everybody was going to go with. And Mary Brown played her role quite well. Now, here's some interesting facts here. Again, I'm not necessarily a conspiracy theorist. I'm a researcher, I'm a historian, and I go with facts. Facts, facts, facts. Now, one of the things that in all of the research I was going through, no one really did a deep dive into Mary Brown and her family and where she was from. But I found her. I found in the 1860 census, Mary's mother. Well, she called herself her mother, as you can see in the census, but she was actually her aunt. And Mary was an orphan. Her mother and father had died when she was an infant. And Rosa, 35, was taking care of her niece. So, as you see, Rosa Brown is a washerwoman born in Ireland. Clearly, you can see that here on this ancestry record, and her personal estate value was valued at $75. Now, she lived in the Detroit Ward 4, which is where Croghan Street is located. And as you can also see here, there's a 2-year-old child here, a little girl. She's 2 years old. Mary Brown is about 7. Now, papers report that Mary was about 9. But, sometimes ages are a little off because sometimes people didn't keep meticulous records, particularly if you were, you didn't have the money to do so. So, this is Rosa Brown raising 2 children. Now, I'm not sure if Anne Brown is Mary's sister, but here we have it. And you can see that Rosa Brown is living on her own, right? Now, this is where things get really interesting. Now, in 1870, Rosa Brown, now you can see Anna Brown is living with her. Now she's 12. 1870, Rosa Brown is 46. She's moved to Ward 6 among higher earning professionals, right? You're seeing all these men that live around her, and they have professions, they have, property, all of that. And Rose's real estate value is $1,000, as you can see right here. Her real estate value, $1,000. That's a quite significant jump from the 75 she had 7 years ago. Not only that, she also lives next door to several prominent businessmen, including multimillionaire E.S. Heinemann, a clothing dealer. Yes. Now, how do you go from being a washerwoman? Yeah, a washerwoman, because there's a lot of washing to get to here, right? Just putting that out there. It's quite interesting that she now has so much more wealth. We know that the girl lied, right? Who had cash pressed in their hand? Somebody did. Because you don't go from a washerwoman to living next door to millionaires. You don't. Unless someone either feels sorry for you, or you did somebody a favor and they're now doing you a favor. Okay, I'm going to let that sit right there. But nobody ever talked about Rosa Brown and Mary Brown and their connection to the Irish community. They're Irish. Look, Rosa Brown says her birthplace is Ireland, and in subsequent censuses, her parents are from Ireland, right? So the next one. Now, okay, by 1880, we have Rose Brown again, right? Ireland. Now they're living on, forgive me for saying this because I'm not from Detroit, Bourbon Street. Now she's widowed, right? Father's birthplace, Ireland. Mother's birthplace, Ireland. And her occupation is keeping house. She's living here with William A. Smith, Mary Smith, and Hugo Smith. So this is Mary Brown. Mary has went ahead, got herself a whole husband. A whole husband. Now, what's interesting is that they are now living in the area where the mob targeted the black families, Bobon. And you will probably see that come up in your research when you start reading about these streets and you see all the different streets that are named in the mob attacks. Now, and of course, at the time now, the neighborhood is both black and white. Rose is living amongst black people as well as white people. You see how that changes? But Mary's all respectable. She has a husband now and she has a baby. Now, I wasn't able to find too much more about them after that without doing a deep dive because, as you know, Smith is a very common name. But just based on the census, I could tell, yes, this is her, the same Mary Brown. Now, what happened to Ellen? Well, according to death records, yes, Ellen did die very young. She died on November 30th, 1874 at the age of 23. Now, as you can see, Ellen is mulatto, which means that she was mixed race, right? She was a housekeeper and widow at the time of her death, and I found the subsequent records that she married Fletcher Young on November 8th, 1865. And her father, and I did cross-reference checking on this, not only in the directories, but also in the census, was that her father, Dennis Hoover, was a barber, right? He was a barber. So Ellen came from a home. She had a home and siblings and a mom and a dad and all that. So why is Ellen caught up in this situation? Don't have all the answers to that, but it's quite clear that she definitely got caught up in that and she didn't make it beyond her 23rd birthday. Now, What you will hear from historians who talk about the Detroit riots of 1863, mob attacks, they often talk about the Civil War tensions at the time, the anti Black sentiment at the time, and all of that is definitely true. I will not take that away at all, of course. But I'm always here to say I like ask deeper questions. Was the Civil War really behind the mob attacks? Think about that. I'm going to show you some evidence that says it was deeper than that. No. Okay, so here's some considerations. The Aboriginal families that were living in Detroit were thriving. They had their own schools, they had their own businesses and churches. Yes, they were an established community. Very, very established. When you look at those maps, you can see they had churches, schools. Yes, bona fide. I'll go back to that. They lived near the Detroit River. Now, if you live near water, even today, it's considered prime real estate. Prime real estate. And between 1970 and 1980, Detroit flipped from being a majority white city to a majority Black city. So, literally, for a century, you had majority white people running Detroit, doing what they wanted to do. Now that there's hardly any quote unquote Black people there, right? I'm going to show you some more stuff, you guys. We're getting to the end of this, but I want to go back to Faulkner for a little bit because this is where it gets interesting. Faulkner was pardoned in 1870 after serving 7 years in prison. After the women, the young ladies, they recanted their story. He gets pardoned. Boom, boom, boom. And he returned to Detroit, where a group of white businessmen helped him start a produce business, which I confirmed in the directories. And at that time, he was going by the name of Thomas Faulkner, not William, but Thomas. So I'm thinking he changed his name a bit. People probably forgot. But he came back. And of course, I'd love to know who these white businessmen are. So as you guys see, I do list my sources where I get my information from. But who helped him, right? Why do you even help him? You know he's not a very nice person. He was a rogue. But guess what? If you took a dive and you got paid, yeah, you might get some help, right? So I'm just putting that out there because you don't go from all of a sudden causing such a big brouhaha in the city and then you get rewarded with the business. Just saying. Some people do, but I can see some other intrigue here. Now, I'm going to go back to Faulkner's statement when he went into prison. Remember when he said, I feel perfectly happy. Now I shall have a house and steady employment? That's what he said. And that's probably what he was talking about when he got his business. He knew back then that he was going to be okay. I just got to do these years. And if you're involved in the criminal spaces and places, you know that sometimes that's how it is. You do the time, you get rewarded. So, and for a man who was running a saloon, why did he say, I'd rather be here in prison than keeping a saloon in Detroit? Which meant that that wasn't really what he wanted to be doing. So why did he do it? And who really gave him the money for that saloon, or who owned the saloon? These are all interesting questions that the history doesn't tell you about this case, right? So in summary, let's sum this up. William Faulkner had a shady and obscure past. No wife, no children, no family. None of that. Okay. The two girls had questionable pasts, right? The men from the mob had shady pasts. Some of them you didn't even know where they came from. Rosa Brown, Mary's aunt, went from washerwoman to owning property near millionaires. And here, check this out. For all the concern and fear that the authorities had in the city, There were only 6 convictions that were handed down. Nobody prosecuted anybody, hardly. 6 men out of all those men who caused the havoc in the city. I mean, they burned down businesses, and not just black ones. There was a big threat to Detroit businesses as well, right? And then, as we often see, there was no compensation or payment made to the black families of the victims at all, at all. So when you look at all these cast of characters, is this really about is this really about, oh, Civil War tensions and anti-black sentiment? Yes, but, right? And when you piece it all together, you have to say to yourself, this was not random. It's not random. Now, I'm going to show you the map of 1863 Detroit again. We're almost nearing the end of this. Look at this map. Again, you see the blue area that's squared off. That's where the black families lived. Now, look what happens in 1870, right? This map shows you how the streets have been paved, where the fire department is serving the neighborhoods, and they now have a sewer system. I mean, a lot has happened in 7 years. And according to the Detroit Historical Society in 1870, it would have been important to show what parts of the city received certain services. This map is shaded pink, where fire protection was offered. Blue highlights paved roads, and red indicate sewer lines, right? So all of this here is the central area, or I guess you could say where everything was happening. Businesses, post office, city hall, everything was right up in here. And this is the area where the black people used to live. But as you can see, there's paved roads. Remember, the blue lines are paved roads, sewer system, everything, all along the Detroit River, right? So it's just funny how a black community thriving, doing what they do, folks come along and say, you know what? I want that. I want that land. I need you out of here. Right? And so, yes, you have the poor white men of the city afraid for their future prospects when it comes to work, position, and jobs. But they're not the ones paving roads, paving streets. Yes, they're doing the labor of that, but they're not the ones calling the shots. Okay? So I'm just going to let that sit there and leave you with this, because, again, with all of these white mob attacks on black communities, there's always something more sinister under it all. And when you talk about incidents such as this and all, you have to look at all the players, and you have to look at what happens to them before, during, and after these moments. So I've given you guys some new information here. Hopefully this will be things that get you to probe even deeper. But yeah, here we are. And thank you so much for listening. And I want to finish by saying that ultimately, in the end, this is to also honor the black families that were forever changed by this incident. Forever changed. All they were doing were trying to create a life for their families. And the very man who was accused of being black was not black, but they still came after the community and destroyed it. So I'll leave you with that, and we'll look forward to doing this again. I love this research. I love this stuff, and thank you guys so much for listening. And I will be talking to you guys soon.